But by mid-century, something else of great importance was taking place. For the first time in Britain, the city dwellers outnumbered their country cousins. Now, how did this come about? Well, excuse me, for a variety of reasons. For instance, in the 1840s, the Irish potato crop fails, result tens of thousands of Irish stream into our cities, become navvies, build the railways, and lay the foundations of the great Irish joke. Later on, the Tsar of all the Russias begins behaving like the Tsar of all the Russias. Result, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees stream into the cities, start living from hand to mouth, and lay the foundations of the great Jewish joke. Although, of course, it wasn't always easy to laugh. But the greatest single reason for the great stream into the towns was that was where the jobs were.
If you could find them, and if you could find somewhere to live. The East End was still medieval in its squalor and overcrowding, and it was no good complaining to the housing authorities. There were no housing authorities. It was every landlord for himself. The streets of the East End, which had once been fashionable, ran to seed as their owners followed the trail of society west. This house, once owned by a rich merchant who'd built it for himself in Fournier Street, Spitalfields, survives in reduced circumstances. Up on the roof, but still no nearer to heaven than they'd ever been, or were likely to be, lived the immigrant silk weavers, whose feet rarely touched the ground, they were working so hard. Penthouses weren't always the best places. Disgusting living conditions were the curse and the scandal of Victorian London, and a danger to all. The sun, which never set on the Empire, never rose in the dark alleys of East London.
Of course, there was always the workhouse, which staved off starvation, but it left you with no dignity. But there then gradually developed a kind of halfway house between the old self-help ethic and the massive state intervention of modern times. This was the charitable trust, which modestly advertised its own goodness by putting its name to a series of working-class dwellings, which at least overcame the worst excesses of the old overcrowding and the murderous lack of sanitation. Things were beginning to look up for the destitute. They were becoming the poor. But there was really no point in advising the poor to keep their noses clean unless you gave them the facilities. And public washhouses of this kind provided the pure gold of Victorian life, this. Running hot water. And washhouses like this were kind of prototype laundromats. And in the old days, the queues might be as much as 10 deep to use the place. You remember that slice of old Victorian piety, cleanliness is next to godliness? Well, in those days, it was frankly next to impossible. And the eminent Victorian who made that peculiar biblical quotation describing God as the ultimate detergent was Mrs. Beeton. And she added that next most important in domestic life was order, maintained, of course, by England's 1.5 million domestics. The servants in the grand townhouses used to work down here in the basements, while above them, good breeding and solvency cruised from chamber to dusted chamber. Now, when the dusting was done, the workers retired at night to the attics under the roofs. So what you got was a kind of gentility sandwich with the bread of domestic labour shielding the cold roast turkey of the Victorian good life. The buildings were large because Victorian families were large. And also, of course, all those under housemaids and second footmen had to be accommodated somewhere.
In its attempt to find an equivalent of the Georgian square, the Victorian age came up with the grandiloquence of a unit like this one at Lancaster Gate. And how Victorian that at the very centre of this complex there stood the symbol of the Church of England, a constant reminder that God was watching, and also, of course, very convenient for attending services with minimum wastage of time and travel. Be it never so humble, there's no place like home, especially if it's got 6 stories, 20 rooms and a porticoed entrance. Life in the square was all stuffed shirt and ptarmigan.